So for those joining us today, thank you very much for doing so. This is today's event. It's called Understanding 2020, the Functions of Emotions in Everyday Life. Before we begin, and for those attending, we as the presenters on this event acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we live and work today, and those being the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging in this country that we know as Australia, and extend that acknowledgement to traditional owners of the lands where our audience are also located today. So my name's Garry Williams and I'm the creative producer of innovation at Melbourne Connect, which is a forthcoming innovation precinct as part of the University of Melbourne. We run a series of events online for this year, obviously, and we're running these continuously, discussing a number of societal themes, emerging technologies and more. But fundamentally, it's a way of connecting with yourselves as the audience, even though that's quite ironic, being that it's not the usual, facing, around each other sort of in-person gathering that we usually prefer. But nevertheless, there is important things to say and important people to communicate that out. So I'm just going to share some slides really, really quickly, just to show you a bit about some context for today. Here we are. So we're at Understanding 2020 today with Dr. Katie Greenaway, who I'll introduce in just one second. But this is part of the Melbourne Connect and Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences event stream for the near future while we run these online. Now, Melbourne Connect, for those who don't know, it's a forthcoming innovation precinct which will be located on the corner of Swanston and Grattan Street. Very, very exciting. Basically big precinct launching at the start of 2021, which is a development partnership between University of Melbourne and Lendlease. Located in Melbourne Connect will be Science Gallery Melbourne, part of a global international network. Also the Melbourne School of Engineering and groups such as Melbourne Accelerator Program, Complex Human Data Hub, Centre for AI and Digital Ethics, and many more from industry and university. We'll have many, many gathering spaces within there to have discussions just like these. And of course, numerous other types of activations such as hackathons, retreats, launches, pitch events, you name it. And of course, public space for us to gather in. This is a view of the central Oculus area, which you can access via Swanston, Cardigan and Grattan Street when it opens. Very, very exciting, and you'll hear more about the precinct as we go. But for today, we're here for this particular event stream. It's a second in the Understanding 2020 events. And we're very privileged to have Dr. Katie Greenaway with us today, who's a senior lecturer and research fellow in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Katie completed her PhD at the University of Queensland before being awarded a fellowship with the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research and later an ARC Discovery Early Career Researcher Award. Her research aims to understand how people form social connections and what benefits those connections have for their emotional well-being. For this work, she's received multiple awards and significant funding for early career research excellence. So amazing, can't wait to hear more about it. With that, today we're discussing emotions, which can be difficult to manage during times of challenge and stress, as we are finding out the hard way right now, of course. We'll also discuss what some effective ways are for us to relieve the pressure and cope. And we'll talk about regulating our emotions. So what does science tell us about changing our feelings by changing the way we think? So I'll stop the share there and leap into it. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's really a timely time to talk about these issues, I think.
It'll be really interesting. I know you've obviously been deeply involved in this research for quite a long period now, but obviously we get some additional context and testing hypotheses. We're right in amongst it, so it's a fascinating social experiment in and of itself. So without further ado, I'll leave it to you. Thanks for bearing with me while I do the admin part, but very excited to have you and can't wait to chat with you afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. And yeah, as Garry said, this loose presentation is called Functions of Emotion in Everyday Life, which is actually the name of the lab that I co-direct out of the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. The way that we think about what we do loosely is about dealing with feelings. So how do we experience emotions and how do we manage those emotions, particularly in heightened circumstances like the ones that we're finding ourselves in. So we're a collection of affective scientists and social psychologists. My co-directors are Dr. Pete Koval and Dr. Elise Kalakarinas, and we're extremely fortunate to have a really wonderful collection of lab managers, senior research assistants, postgraduate students, honours students, and also volunteer undergraduate students. Their names are here, and they're really the lifeblood of the lab that we lead. And broadly speaking, what we do in the field lab is a few things. One is we're really interested in the experience of emotion and how that affects us and maybe why we experience emotions. Another thing that we do is look at what's called emotion regulation, which is really how we manage our emotions. And of course, we also study emotions, and I'll talk a little bit about the approach that we use there, which is a little bit unusual in traditional psychological research. So I don't think it's exaggerating at this point to say that we are finding ourselves in a global mental health crisis. Many people will be aware that we are entering a period where we expect to see a large increase in mental health difficulties and, of course, also suicidal ideation. But even more lesser degree or less intensive mental health issues are also on the rise at the moment. So we're seeing a really large increase in mental distress across the globe, but also here in Australia we've seen an increase in some pretty problematic emotional states for people. Stress, loneliness, even boredom is on the rise, and a reduction in some emotional states that maybe we want to see more of, things like optimism and happiness. And this picture seems a little bit dire at the moment, and it might lead us to think that really what we want to do with emotion is get rid of it. We want to reduce it. We want to feel less negative emotion. But actually, that's not the perspective that we have when we approach emotion. We tend to think of emotions as being something that's useful to have in our everyday lives. Emotions serve a lot of functions that can really end up benefiting us. So, for example, emotions motivate us to take action. They can signal that something in our environment has changed or needs to change. So if we feel anger, for example, it might motivate us to confront someone, to change the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Or if we experience fear, it might make us leave a situation that is uncomfortable or not so good for us. Emotions also help us make decisions. So this is this kind of gut feeling reaction. So they actually end up revealing to us sometimes what we really are interested in. And perhaps most importantly, emotions help us connect with other people. So experiencing the same emotional state, even if that's a negative emotional state, can be a really powerful way of bringing people together. So the way that we think about our emotions is that they can be troublesome and unpleasant sometimes, but they can also be useful. So our research is really an exercise in understanding how do we harness those emotions and turn them to good account. How do we feel more of what we want to feel and less of what we don't want to feel? And that's the science of emotion regulation, which is really about feeling how we want to feel. So how do we increase the emotions we want and reduce or get rid of the emotions that we don't want? And there's a lot of really great research, some of it coming out of our lab, around evidence-based strategies for dealing with emotions and managing that emotional state. I'll talk a little bit now about some candidate strategies that have been shown to be really effective for dealing with our emotions. And this is maybe something that people want to touch on a little bit in the Q&A afterwards as well. So these strategies here are ones that have a lot of really robust evidence behind them about how they impact on our emotional state. Starting here with one that I'm sure people are very familiar with at the moment, distraction. Netflix is amazing for this. It really just involves orienting our attention away from what's causing our emotional state. And this is really effective at lowering emotional intensity, at least in the short term, because we're not thinking about the things that are actually causing our emotions. But of course, it can be problematic in the long term if we're not really dealing with an issue that's causing us stress or grief, and we keep orienting away from it. Another strategy that people might be familiar with just in their everyday lives is rumination, which is repetitive thinking about what's causing your emotions or about your emotions themselves. This is really often associated with negative emotions, things like anxiety or depression. And when we perseverate on our emotional state, or we dwell on those emotions, it actually increases or enhances the emotion that we're feeling. So this can be a problematic strategy when it's used in the long term, especially when focusing on negative emotions, because it can increase those feelings of anxiety and depression. What's interesting is there's some emerging research out of the University of Melbourne suggesting that rumination about positive events or positive emotion actually might be somewhat beneficial for people's well-being, which I'm happy to talk about later as well. Another strategy that people sometimes use is what's called expressive suppression. This is just where we don't show how we're feeling on our face. We hide our emotions from other people. And often people's intuition about this strategy is that it's going to help them get rid of their emotions. But actually, it doesn't seem to impact on the emotional experience. So it stops other people from knowing how you're feeling, but it doesn't necessarily change how intensely you're feeling those emotions yourself. And for that reason, it can be problematic to use this strategy over the longer term. It's been associated with reduced well-being, in part because people feel like they can't be their authentic selves, and that's difficult for them over the long term. But it can also be socially problematic because, as I'll talk about in a second, if we're not showing other people how we're feeling, it can be more difficult to connect with other people. And so hiding our emotions sometimes isn't the best emotion regulation strategy. One strategy that does seem to be relatively effective for at least improving our well-being is social sharing. So this is discussing our emotions with other people, talking about them, or even in some cases thinking about these emotions ourselves in relation to other people. So when we share our emotional state with other people, it's been shown to increase feelings of positive emotion and reduce feelings of negative emotion, although it's really important to pay attention to the content of what we're discussing with other people, because occasionally we can get into these processes of co-rumination where if we feel negative and someone else feels negative, we actually end up exacerbating that in one another. So having a really productive conversation around those emotions is extremely important. And when we think about our emotions to ourselves, there's work that Elise Kalakarinos has done a lot on around emotion differentiation or emotion labeling. And it's really important to specifically talk about which emotions we're feeling. So rather than saying we feel bad in general, saying that we feel anxious or that we feel sad or that we feel angry, and getting to that level of specificity is really important for understanding how we're actually going to implement emotion regulation strategies down the track. One strategy that I think people will be familiar with if you've ever done any cognitive behavioral therapy or associated therapies is cognitive reappraisal. So this is just taking a different perspective on an emotional situation, thinking about it in a different way that helps you lower the emotional intensity of the situation. So one common way that people do this is to find a silver lining in a situation. So if we're feeling, upset that we are at home in quarantine, we might focus on a positive in that situation. Think about how it's given us more time to work on, specific skills that we want to develop, or it's given us more time to spend with family. And reappraisal has been shown to be really useful, particularly when we can't control our situation. The reason being that if we can control the situation, it's sometimes better to just change the situation in order to change our emotions. But if we're not able to adjust something about our circumstances, for example, we're at home because of restrictions placed at the state and federal level, then it might be better to reappraise our emotions and to help ourselves feel better by thinking in a different way. And another strategy that people might be familiar with if they've ever done any form of mindfulness practice is emotional acceptance. This just involves non-judgmentally accepting your emotions as they are, understanding that it's normal to experience a range of different emotions, and not putting pressure on yourself to feel a particular way, but just noticing how you're feeling in the moment. And it might seem a little bit ironic, but this strategy actually does lower emotional intensity, the emotional experience. And the reason it's ironic is because we're not actually trying to change our emotional state, but it does actually help us feel better in the long term, both mentally and physically. So, just like emotions aren't a one-size-fits-all situation, neither are the strategies that we use to change those emotions. And it's actually important to have a range of different tools in your emotional toolkit to be able to adjust your emotional state. So you're not always going to distraction, for example, but distraction might be useful in certain circumstances. So identifying what's the right strategy for you and in the right moment. Just to finish up here, I'll talk really briefly about the way that we study emotion in everyday life, which is using experience sampling methodology. Sometimes people talk about this as capturing life as it's lived. We use smartphone technology, an app that Pete Caval has developed called SEMA3 that prompts people on their smartphones to complete very short surveys multiple times a day. So we can get insight into how people are feeling across the day and across different circumstances that they find themselves in. And this is quite different than the maybe traditional lab-based approach to research that some people might be familiar with. So in this work, we're really interested in capturing emotion as it's lived in everyday life, in people's natural settings that they find themselves in as they go about their day. And we have these multiple measurement occasions, which gives us a lot of power in our analyses to detect not only differences between people, so how I'm different from another individual, but also differences within people, so how I'm different from myself several hours ago. And we can look at this at the day level or even at the hourly level. And this is just one example of some data that we have collected using this approach. This is led by Elise Kalakarinas. And she surveyed a number of Belgian students who had just finished their first university exams. These are individual participants, and their graphs are shaded according to whether they failed the majority of their exams or passed the majority of their exams. And what you can see already is how much variation there is in the emotion that people are experiencing. So some people really differ in terms of the amount of negative emotion they experience, which is the red line in these graphs, compared to the amount of positive emotion, which is the blue line. But also there's a really high degree of variation across individuals in terms of how people experience that emotion. Some people show a really large amount of variability in the emotions they experience over time, whereas some people are relatively static in the emotions that they experience. So we can get a really fine-grained level of analysis when we try to understand the emotions that people are experiencing in these really important everyday contexts. Another example of a project that we're working on at the moment is studying phenomena that haven't previously been studied dynamically or over time. So one example is secrecy. This is a project that we're working on at the moment. And it turns out that secrecy is actually incredibly common. So around about 97% of people have a secret at any given time. And it's not just one big secret that people are keeping. In fact, on average, people are keeping about 13 secrets. And those are sometimes secrets kept from absolutely everyone, but they're also secrets that are kept from only certain people or even just one person. And when we use experience sampling methodology, we can understand secrecy as it occurs across people's everyday. So we don't know really basic things about secrecy, things like how much do people actually think about their secrets outside of times when they're interacting with other people, or how many times in a day do people actually have to conceal a secret from someone else, and what impact does that have on their psychology. So if you're interested in any of this work, please get in touch with us. We'd love to have you as a participant in one of our studies, or to hear about how you think experience sampling can be useful in your life and work. If you are interested in participating, you can access our current studies via this somewhat cumbersome link, or you can just Google Field Lab University of Melbourne and you'll find us. And one thing that we also do is discuss with people in industry how to actually do experience sampling technology. This is a really powerful tool for assessing, for example, things like workers' experience at work over time at a more fine-grained level of analysis, or also customers' experience of certain products that they, interact with. So we do run experience sampling workshops on this work as well, and please do get in touch if you're interested in that. So I'll finish up here because I know we want plenty of time for discussions, but just to acknowledge my co-directors in this lab and our really wonderful lab members, and of course the funding that we've received from the Australian Research Council and also from the University of Melbourne to develop the CENA3 app that allows us to do this research. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was incredible, especially seeing that data over time with the positive or negative associations. Incredible, and that always highly important to see that visually represented. I will invite anyone who has particular questions, whether related to a number of points that Katie's raised or beyond. But we did have a question just during. Sorry, you can pose those in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Claire had actually asked whether you can see certain personality traits with those emotion management types. So if, for example, would passive-aggressive people, by their nature, tend to use expressive suppression?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and there is a lot of research on individual differences in emotion regulation, and there is some work that suggests that people with certain personality types or certain ways of thinking do gravitate towards particular emotion regulation strategies. And what's really emerging in the field at the moment is the understanding that we really need to resist this urge to just use one strategy, and it can actually be problematic if we're over relying on one strategy, and even if that's because it feels natural or good to us, it turns out that having this range of tools in our toolkit seems to be more useful for people to be able to deal with their emotions. So yeah, resisting that urge and trying out new strategies, I think is a good approach.
Certainly, thank you. And by that token, I mean, we've got Archie asking about how would we cope with our stress or other negative emotions during exam period. So looking at a particular instance from a student perspective, but obviously a number of us have periods where we are essentially being tested, maybe in a short period of time. So leading back into that emotion regulation, all the sort of all those elements of it, what do you sort of advocate for or recommend in terms of coping with stress during those singular experiences?
I think there's probably a couple of things that we do, and I agree. I mean, exams are a particularly stressful time, but of course, all of us encounter particularly challenging periods at certain times or another. One thing that I think is really useful to think about is, first of all, whether there's any scope to change the situation that you find yourself in. So for some people, elements that might be particularly stressful or challenging are to do with a particular environment that they find themselves in. And if they can change that environment in some way, then they can change their emotional state. Now, for something like an exam period, for example, that really is out of your control. You can't change the fact that you have to sit these exams in order to pass your degree. And so they're looking for a strategy that might help you deal with the emotions that are coming up through that, be that, anxiety or even sometimes, positive emotions like excitement. So something like reappraisal could be really useful in this instance. Think about it in a different way. Try to reinterpret this as an exciting phase rather than an anxiety-provoking phase. That form of reappraisal has actually been shown to improve people's performance on upcoming tasks if you can reinterpret physiological jitters as a sign of excitement rather than anxiety. But also thinking about the situation, in a different way. So be that trying to take a distanced perspective, almost imagining as though this situation is happening to someone else. That can be an effective way of dealing with anxiety.
Yep.
Or using a different strategy, something like acceptance, for example. So just understanding that this is normal to feel this way and trying to give yourself a break and practice a little bit of self-compassion in understanding that it's normal to feel how you feel.
Yeah, absolutely. You are not alone in this instance, of course. I don't think we're going to be lacking in questions because they're rolling through thick and fast. And coincidentally, I had one to ask, and then Simone Mora and Sam Kelly have also mentioned it in the question. So I'll package it up into one. You referenced before around accessing research about rumination on positive emotions. So you talked about distraction, rumination, expressive suppression, and then you mentioned that there was further research available for people to dive in. Could you, I am happy to publish that out afterwards on our social media channels, but did you want to point people in the right direction for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually work out of Brock Bastian's lab. So I know many people will have seen Brock's presentation a few weeks ago. This is work actually led by Sean Murphy, who was a postdoc in Brock's lab. And in that research, they look at rumination around positive events as well as negative events. And they find that ruminating about positive events actually seems to be associated with more eudaimonic forms of well-being. So these are forms of well-being that aren't just about feeling good, but are about having a sense of mastery and purpose. When you think about the things that our mind, wanders to and latches onto, often it is these kinds of future plans that we have, things that we want to be able to resolve and understand. And so if that's actually positively toned, then that can be a good experience for people.
Absolutely. I'll seek to find it and publish it out while we're going. But nevertheless, we'll forge on. I just to let everyone know, we'll touch upon again some of the elements that Katie mentioned, such as secrecy, mindfulness, and emerging technologies. We have another one. I guess I'll dive into what Stephanie Oliver posed early, which is around with the emotion of fear. So can you talk about this in relation to, obviously, our current situation and specifically concern for safety from something which is, we know it's there, but it is invisible to us, so meaning infectious diseases. So can you explain to us a little bit more about how we process the emotions of fear in relation to our current situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, fear is an emotion that people will be very familiar with at the moment, and associated emotions, things like anxiety, for example. I think when it comes to fear around something like, a virus and potentially catching a virus, this is something where we can start to think about, well, what are the things that we can control in our environment? These are things like practicing good hygiene, wearing a mask if that's right for you, of course, following restrictions and regulations from the government around who we should be seeing and when. So controlling your environment in that way sometimes helps people feel a little more comfortable because they feel like they're doing things to change the situation. But then there's a level of fear that sometimes happens when we engage in this rumination process where we worry and perseverate about what could happen or, you know, what may happen in the future. And I think it's important to recognize when those kinds of processes happen, and trying to implement strategies to really help deal with that emotional experience that isn't anything to do with, you know, what you may or may not be doing with your behavioral state, but it's more just to do with how you're experiencing your environment and the current circumstance. So again, using something like reappraisal or acceptance to help you deal with that emotional state might be a useful approach. Or also, one I haven't mentioned, you know, in the Q&A period, but I think is really powerful is social sharing. So letting other people in on how you're feeling can be a really powerful tool, both to help you with your emotions, but also to help other people, because you may find that others are feeling the same way around you, and you can brainstorm and really tackle this problem together. And as you said before, Garry, just feel like you're not so alone.
Yeah, certainly. And in the last event, in the Understanding 2020 event stream that we ran with Professor Brock Bastian, we were talking about emotionally extreme life experiences. And I think in that context, we were discussing, I guess, you know, some gender differences to a large degree, and essentially touching upon, you know, men opening up, for example, as one example of sharing more about emotions. What has research sort of showed you a bit more in terms of whether by gender, but also age differences, particularly relevant to now as opposed to, say, 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, really interesting question. Actually, I'm not sure that I'm well placed to answer it, because I am a social psychologist, so I tend to focus on the situations that we find ourselves in and how that impacts across a range of different people, rather than taking a more individual difference approach and looking at, for example, you know, gender or age or personality traits and how they impact on these kinds of processes. So the way that I would look at this problem is less of a cohort or an age difference and more of a situational difference, you know, how we were as a society 6 months ago compared to now.
Absolutely. Okay. Now, I do, as I mentioned, I would touch upon some of the things you mentioned during your presentation. So mindfulness obviously has been, you know, much more not accepted, but much more prevalent within society, and obviously advocated for by many people and shared openly across, say, social media channels or amongst ourselves personally. So, where do you see the research within the Feel Lab progressing in terms of mindfulness, both communications to the public, but also enhancements to your own research, and particularly with context of this time we're in?
Yeah, well, it's actually a very timely question, because one of the projects that we're getting ready to run at the moment is actually a mindfulness intervention run across daily life, which is something that we really don't have good data on currently. So this is a project that's led by Pete Koval, and in it, people will be randomly assigned to different conditions to use varying degrees of mindfulness practice versus not across you know, a set period of time. But mindfulness, of course, is a multi-billion-dollar industry, billion with a B. And this is something that is becoming really increasingly prevalent across, you know, lots of different channels in our society. And one thing that I think I would point out is there's some really great work that Nicholas Van Dam, who's also at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences, has done, looking at taking a slightly more critical approach to mindfulness and making sure that the mindfulness tools or practices that you're using are evidence-based, and just making sure that it's backed up by that science. Because with this proliferation of so many different mindfulness opportunities, sometimes we can stray a little bit far from the roots of mindfulness, which are really about practicing this non-judgmental acceptance, but it's also a really fundamentally social process as well.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, it's not quite it's somewhat of a follow-on, but do you feel, I guess, in certainly in our current environmental context, there's been this inherent rush to quickly leap into utilising mindfulness, quickly get fit, a number of things to, I guess, distract ourselves from our current situation. How do we? It is segueing back into what you've been saying, but I guess around making mindfulness sticky for ourselves and taken up as a habit as opposed to something to fill the time at the moment where we've found perhaps a little bit more. How about that sort of stickiness? Are we talking about a length of time to form a habit?
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable insight because, mindfulness isn't a quick fix by any means. It takes practice and it takes dedication to develop these thought patterns that are going to end up helping us in the longer term. But I also think that, taking an evidence-based approach to whatever you're doing the research on, which app or website or, other form that you're getting the mindfulness training from, really investigating who created those tools and, have a think about whether they're doing that purely for profit, whether they have a research background or whether they've, acknowledged the science behind what they're trying to do. I'm not by any means saying that, the apps and websites are useless at all. But just really taking an evidence-based approach and making sure that what you're actually looking at does have good, solid research behind it.
And certainly, I mean, this event stream was also, I guess, conceived and brought about as a way of countering, I guess, a lot of non-evidence-based research content being pushed out very, very quickly while people were in, a sheer state of panic, to be honest, with largely unaware of what the next few weeks or even months would look like. So certainly that's why we place such importance and emphasis on it. I do want to loop back a little bit because obviously as we discuss the concepts, sometimes we're still processing what we're hearing and trying to make sense of it all. You've touched on it a little bit, but I do want to acknowledge Amana Sabrina's question. So she said, "Hi, Katie, you mentioned the use of multiple strategies to cope and manage emotions. So how do we effectively know which strategy works best for us in the short term as opposed to the long term if we were looking for something to grasp to, I guess?"
Yeah, what an excellent question. And if you know the answer, please tell me, because this is exactly what is at the heart of this really emerging research area, which broadly speaking we talk about as regulatory flexibility, which has a couple of different elements to it. One is having a range of strategies available to you. So not just always choosing the one strategy, but having multiple ones that you can use. It also has to do with, of course, you as an individual and what your sort of predisposition is towards certain strategies, whether you can actually effectively implement certain strategies, which it's more difficult for certain people than others to implement particular strategies. And then, of course, there's a situation that we find ourselves in, which is really identifying whether we can actually implement a strategy that we have. I've talked a little bit about, how reappraisal seems to be useful when it's a situation we can't control, and that helps us manage our emotions, but it's less useful in a situation where we can control it. Other research has suggested that the level of intensity that we feel the emotion at is another kind of contextual factor. So if this is a really super emotional situation and you just want to deal with the emotion in the moment, something like distraction is actually really useful in helping you lower that emotional intensity, whereas something like reappraisal that does require a lot more cognitive resources it's really hard to kind of get online and actually use in the moment when you're feeling very worked up. And then there's, other considerations, things like, is this a social situation, for example? So some research that Elise and I have done has shown that a strategy like expressive suppression, which is typically considered a maladaptive strategy, it doesn't affect your emotional state and it can have these well-being and social costs, can actually be really useful in certain social situations. Even suppressing positive emotion in some situations can be beneficial. So really being able to identify what are the needs of the situation, and which strategy do I think would go best with this situation, and can I effectively implement that strategy? Because if the answer to the last question is no, then I might need to go back to the second point and think about a different strategy that I could use in this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, and absolutely. I think we all certainly seek to understand more about ourselves, don't we? Not only coping mechanisms, but how we inherently tick by the same token. I'm going to touch on a question in just a second around the arts and creative industries based engagement practices. So some elements of what you might have been involved in from a creative industries realm. But before that, I really want to go back to the notion of what you were discussing, which forms part of the Field Labs section of research on secrecy. I find that absolutely fascinating because it is, well, it's just there. It's really not talked about too much, and yet we all possess it. And it's deeply fascinating subject that I think we would all love to understand a lot more. But I'm very glad to have found that, because it raises even more questions, I find. So you mentioned before that on average, any person may hold around 13 secrets at a time. Was that it? What other sort of insights have been found as you've dove into this research, and where is that progressing to in the near future?
Well, this is work that's really led by Dr. Michael Slepian, who's based at Columbia Business School, and he and I and Elise have an ARC discovery project about secrecy in everyday life. So we're really just starting to get to the bottom of some of these insights. But one thing that Michael's research has shown is that this may seem a little bit counterintuitive. The thing that's problematic about secrecy, I'm sure many of us have this experience of feeling weighed down by a secret or burdened by a secret. The thing that's really problematic about secrecy isn't actually the times that we spend concealing those secrets from other people. So having a conversation and I have to remember, oh, I can't say something about the topic related to the secret. What seems to be much more problematic for our well-being over the longer term is the time we spend thinking about our secrets. We actually think about our secrets alone a lot more than we conceal our secrets with other people. And this is associated with kinds of thought and emotion regulation strategies like rumination, which we know can be really problematic for people's emotional well-being. So ironically, it's the times we're alone with our secrets that seems to be really worrisome.
I can't wait to dive into more of it. But, obviously I don't want to railroad, obviously what we're talking about today in terms of emotion regulation. I'll come back to what I referenced before, which was around the arts creative industries. So Tanya Johnson has asked that question. So any ideas about arts-based engagement practices? So whether already actioned in the process or potentially in the future, and also the ability to pair that or embed that with mindfulness practices. Do you have any examples for us, or happy to speculate on what could emerge in the near future?
Yeah, I think a really valuable insight, because creativity and arts-based practices are certainly increasing at the moment, which is a good thing, because they do really help us engage with and regulate our emotions. So often I think these kinds of creative practices can help us process our emotions. They might even help with some of these processes of emotion labeling or emotion differentiation. They can help us get to the bottom of exactly how we're feeling, which is helping us choose the right strategy for changing how we want to feel. But it can also be a process of emotion regulation in and of itself. So we're actually processing experiences while doing these creative enterprises. In terms of work on this, I'd really encourage people to check out the DAX Centre if they haven't already, which is a really excellent collection of artwork related to mental health issues and a lot of people with lived experience, but also artistic experience, and sort of combining those two elements together in a really valuable way.
I perhaps a little biased, but I could also answer that a little bit as well, because forthcoming to Melbourne Connect and a group that will work closely with the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences is Science Gallery Melbourne. So part of a global network of public-facing institutions, firmly focused on predominantly engaging 15 to 25-year-olds in STEM or STEAM-based practice by showcasing a number of installations that combine the art with the technology, with the scientific research. So that's going to launch at the start of 2021 in Melbourne Connect, on the corner of Swanston and Grattan Street. But the opening exhibition will be called Mental. So we will firmly touch upon societal issues that predominantly concern these 15 to 25-year-old age group, and have some discussions that potentially people are not necessarily comfortable with initially, but will certainly leave them with plenty to ponder as they go. So look, another exciting part of the university, but I think we both know through Science Gallery, the DAX and many other things, there's plenty of ways to embed the arts into science communications for sure. Salmia has mentioned the question, and we are veering very quickly towards the end of our time. So thank you all so much for putting through so many questions and for seeing so many of you head along today. Salmia's posed a question. She's wondering if you've come across a marked difference between strategies to manage emotions while at work versus not, based on your research. So Salmia is interested in everyday life emotions, and work, in comments, is a pretty big part of everyday life. So just interested in knowing your thoughts. It sometimes takes up much more than a third of our life, as we all know. Yeah.
Of course, yes. And a lot of challenges around work at the moment, I know, from people's experiences right now. The evidence doesn't necessarily suggest that, for example, different strategies are differentially useful at work versus not at work. What I think the research does show is having regular breaks from work is really beneficial. This can actually be breaks in the work day. This is work by Dr. Stacey Parker out of the University of Queensland. And she's done some work on what are called micro breaks. These are just really short attention diversions from what we're currently doing that help restore us. So it could be, taking a really short walk. It could be having a quick chat to a coworker or someone else. It could be, checking social media, but really regularly taking time out from the work day to kind of restore ourselves and to restore our attention and our energy levels seems to be really beneficial, not just for people's productivity at work, but also their ability to disconnect from work when they're at home, which is a really important part of creating that sort of restoration as well. So making sure that work is at work, and we have this time for ourselves in the evening or in other times to get that kind of level of restoration.
Restoration, absolutely. And Huliang has also added to that. So to Salmia's question, which you've just answered in terms of separation, we're in this deeply ironic time now. Would there be a difference in emotion regulation now that people are forced to work from home and home is the new normal? So essentially, how are we going to separate to some degree if we're, at the moment I'm running an event at the same table I eat my dinner. So it's there's certainly not a huge inherent separation right there, but we seek to make it so.
Yeah, I think it's a really point well taken. I'm certainly experiencing this myself at the moment. I think it makes it even more important to find these times to disconnect psychologically from work, even if we can't, physically disconnect in the environment that we find ourselves in, to find these little grace periods where we can give our minds a break is really useful in that circumstance. And one piece of advice that I got from a colleague recently was to remind me that those kinds of breaks aren't procrastination. They are valuable in and of their own right, because they're helping you get the energy and attention to devote to the tasks that you have coming up. So really making time and space to give yourself a break in that sense, I think, is really valuable.
Wonderful. Oh, look, we're basically just about out of time, but it's not that, people are more than happy to pose questions, but also we're conscious of, we don't want to run 2-hour sessions because we do acknowledge that there's an inherent fatigue in constantly being online, and it's important to connect personally with those we can. So with that, do you have any final thoughts, both in final things to convey in terms of where the research is leading you in the very short term, and anything else to advocate for, such as where people should direct their attention for further resources?
Sure. Yeah. Well, one project that I haven't mentioned, but is one that's starting up soon, is being led by Elise Kalakarinos. And this is really a question that actually is really interesting for us as emotion regulation researchers, which is about, do people actually put effort into changing their emotions and managing their emotions? We tend to assume that people are doing this all the time because that's what we study and that's our bias. But actually some emerging evidence is suggesting that, people mostly don't necessarily want to change their emotional state. And so what impact does that have on people's ability to regulate themselves down the track if it's not, top of mind and not a goal that they have in their everyday life? Then what impact does that have on their ability to actually regulate their emotions? So that's one thing that we're a little bit interested in looking at in the future. And, if people are interested in any of those projects that I've mentioned, potentially participating or hearing more about them, then please do get in touch with us via the Feel Lab website. And we're more than happy to, discuss this work with people who are interested.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Look, we'll put some details out on our, our Twitter stream soon, and as I mentioned, we will publish this event out on our YouTube channels. But look, once again, thank you so much for participating today. I know you've been doing a number of talks of late in sort of different sort of focus areas, but we really appreciate your time, and it's just fascinating research. Can't wait to see where it leads in the short and long term.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity. It's really been very fun, and also always keen to talk about this research.
Okay, great. Well, look, we've had a number of people chime in today, and thank you very much all for posing your questions as well. So we're going to wrap it up now. I'll just share a couple of slides just to add a little bit of additional context. So my name's Garry Williams, and we've been in discussion with Dr. Catherine, or Katie Greenaway, today, who's a Senior Lecturer and Research Fellow in Social Psychology at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. So there's some Twitter handles there if you'd like to take note, and certainly dive in through there. All the respective links will be published throughout. So my name's Garry Williams. I'm the creative producer of innovation for Melbourne Connect at the University of Melbourne. And you can follow along on our social media channels. Melbourne Connect will be launching at the end of 2020/start of 2021 with a number of events firmly in this sort of realm. So that's been us. This has been Understanding 2020 Functions of Emotions in Everyday Life. I want to thank you all so much for attending, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks again.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.